good evening, everybody. I will talk about Iceland's way out of the present financial crisis. And the talk is organized such I will first say a few things about why Iceland is interesting in the context of the financial crisis. Secondly, I will show you how Iceland has succeeded in progressing through the crisis, how it has come out of it. And then I will explain the Icelandic approach to the crisis, how Iceland adjusted, and I will explain what I call the strategy of redistribution, which is really what I think is a bit special for Iceland as a crisis measure. And then lastly, I will end up with some lessons. And I think there are lessons in the Icelandic case for the policy debate about austerity and Keynesian crisis management, which has, of course, been featured very highly in Europe and elsewhere, and even came into the recent election to the European Parliament, one of the explanations for the protest votes. So firstly, why is Iceland interesting? Iceland was the first country to fall, so to speak, in the present financial crisis in the autumn of 2008, and it sort of caught the attention of the world media. It was a major financial collapse with the three main banks of the country all becoming bankrupt within a very short period of time, and they brought down the financial system of the country nearly completely. About 90% of the financial system came down in just about 1 week, and the collapse came in the collapse of a major bubble economy, probably the biggest bubble economy the world has seen, at least as measured in relation to the size of the national economy. And it was a typical bubble economy, but only more extreme than most. And if we look at what sort of fed or created the bubble, it was an unprecedented level of debt accumulation and business speculation. So it was the business sector, it was the financial sector who were borrowing tremendous amounts of money abroad to buy other firms within Iceland and then abroad in the Scandinavian countries, in England and elsewhere. And so it was leverized takeovers and acquisitions, pure business speculation. There was a bit of a housing bubble as well, but that was a minor part of it. It was primarily the sort of the upper class, the top class, who were engaging in this speculation. And Reinhardt and Rogoff, in their major studies of financial crisis during the last 8 centuries, they did a book on debt accumulation, which was published in 2010. And there they remark and show the data that the debt accumulation in Iceland, and in fact in Ireland as well, is the largest they've ever seen. And in fact, Iceland started slightly later than Ireland, but they went up to similar levels. So the speed and the extent of the debt accumulation and the speculation was significantly larger in Iceland than in Ireland. And then when the crash came, it was one of the most expensive financial collapses also in recent history, and so on all measures this was a major financial collapse, major financial crisis. But now we can see now, 5 years after it all happened, that the consequences were not really as bad as expected. And that's what makes it interesting. So what was it in the policy reactions in Iceland in the way the institutional setup was specific, if anything, which can explain how Iceland fared through the crisis. Perhaps not as badly, at least as we expected, and as many expected. And so let's look at some of the figures about how Iceland progressed through the crisis in comparison to other countries. And what this graph here shows is the black columns. They show the accumulated contraction of GDP during the crisis. In some cases, like in Greece, they had 6 years. The light gray columns show the number of years with contraction, and the dark columns show the accumulated, the sum of the total contraction. So Greece had a contraction for 6 years in a row, altogether amounting to 26% of GDP. It's similar as the contraction in, almost as big as the contraction in the US from 1929 up to 1932 during the Great Depression. So, but Iceland had 2 years, in 2009 and 2010, and the overall contraction was 11%, that the GDP came down. So at least there are 5 countries which had more contraction of the national product. Ireland had a similar level, 10%, but that was spread out for a longer period in Ireland. And then on the far left you have the average for the 27 European countries, European Union. And the next slide shows a more direct comparison of, firstly, the GDP contraction and between Iceland and the Eurozone countries, the average for the Eurozone countries. And that's the whole lines. The black one is for Iceland, the gray one for the Eurozone countries, and the broken lines are unemployment. And so you see Iceland, of course, went deeper down and had 2 years. But after that, from 2011, it's actually doing better than the Eurozone countries on average in keeping up growth. We had 2.6% growth in 2011, slightly less in 2012, and up again in 2013. The prognosis for this year is 3.7% growth. And there was actually a new prognosis for next year, just recently issued, and that calls for more than 5% growth in 2014. Still to come, but the prospects, it looks good. So the recovery has been persistent from 2011, and these are, even though these are not historically particularly high growth rates, they are quite high compared to growth rates in Europe and elsewhere in the advanced countries. A more direct comparison of Ireland, and Ireland is probably the country which is closest to Iceland in the sense that the bubble experience and the extent of the collapse. So when we compare the GDP, Ireland went slightly faster down, but was faster up again to begin with. But then they had a double dip in 2012-13 after the increasing austerity policies, which were implemented throughout the European Union and with the policy recommendations of the European Central Bank and the IMF, and so they suffered from that, whereas Iceland did not. And just to but first to look at the unemployment figures, you see how unemployment in Ireland went up to much greater heights than in Iceland, and it came down also significantly slower. And while the Icelandic unemployment rate has been sort of coming down from 2010, the Irish one only started to come down in 2013 and is still at significantly higher level. And in fact, Iceland's success in combating the unemployment rate is really quite exceptional, I think. And it's actually the 5th, this is February this year. Iceland has the 5th lowest unemployment rate in the West. I mean, this is not just the European Union; it's the OECD countries. The US is there, and yeah, that's a grouping. Japan as well. So this is. I mean, for these indicators, which are obviously very important, this is a significant success. The government debt went up to just over 100%. It's come down since then to about 95%. Will probably approach 90% next year. So, so that's an improvement. One of the consequences of the collapse was that the Icelandic krona, which is probably the world's smallest independent denomination currency, it collapsed quite drastically, came down in a big way, which produced inflation. And we see the consequence here on the real wage index, which came down and started to come down in 2008 and bottomed out in 2010, 9-10, but has been crawling back. So this was a contraction of the real wage index by some 12%. The real disposable earnings of households actually came down more, closer on average to about 20%, and private consumption. But mainly due to the government policies, the real disposable earnings of the lower income groups came down much less than the average. They came down by some 9%, while the top 10% of the income ladder, they came down by almost 40%. So now to address the policy issues. How did Iceland tackle the crisis? And I mean, the classical policy debate and the most prominent debate has been the questions of Keynesian stimulus approach or the austerity approaches. And since Iceland has succeeded in getting the growth up quite fast and sustainable after the collapse and low level of unemployment, that would seem to indicate that this must have been subjected to Keynesian stimulus measures. And to some extent it was, but that's not the whole or the only part of the story, because there was both stimulus and austerity. It was a mixed approach. It was a mixed approach. And in fact, that applies to most of the countries. Most of the countries in the West who were hit by the financial crisis, they started their reactions with stimulus measures, in many ways quite big, in many cases quite big stimulus measures, increased government expenditures to tackle the crisis, and in some cases these were expenditures for saving banks and taking on direct costs of the crisis. But then the policy atmosphere, as I'm sure you're all very much aware of, changed towards the austerity orientation, and that is an understandable approach when government debt is at a very high level, and which tends to happen during financial crisis, that private debt gets transferred over to government debt. So, but Iceland, even though it went into an emergency program with the IMF, The IMF was actually quite good. We expected the worst from IMF with the lessons from the Asian financial crisis of the late 1990s. We were really worried about the IMF, but they were quite good. They just worked out the plan of cutting the government deficit, which was carried out like that, as these columns here show. And they left it completely up to the Icelandic government to choose the measures, how they could obtain those. So it was up to the government to what extent they would cut expenditures and to what extent they would raise taxes. And in fact, they did both, had a mixed approach, both expenditure cuts, selected ones, not all over, and there were also some increases, significant increases, cuts in some areas, increases in others, and then taxes were raised primarily on the higher income groups and on businesses, which is probably sounds like a sin in the Western economy environment. So here you see how the Icelandic, the public expenditures, the black line, went up in a big way in 2008. In that year, there were some one-time direct costs associated with resurrecting the financial system. But after 2008, it was, then you will find more stimulus expenditures in terms of job creation and support to industry and things like that. And this all happened at the same time as the tax revenues came down, so producing the deficit. And Iceland graduated from the IMF program in 2011, and the IMF were really satisfied. They felt that this was a successful case for them. Their policies were working well. So they organized a major conference in Iceland, sort of celebrating, and got Paul Krugman and Joseph Stiglitz to come and hail the IMF and the Icelandic government. So we were not fully balancing the budget by 2011, but that's probably going to happen this year, 2014. The budget is balanced this year. So just a brief, this is what this shows is, has some relevance for the austerity stimulus arguments, but one must also mention in that sort of policy debate, it's not always clear what people mean by austerity and even by stimulus, which is interesting when you dive into it, because a lot of these issues which tend to be talked about in politics, they are taken as such common sense. But I think you can look at stimulus and austerity both in absolute senses and in relative ways, and you can analyze it further to especially if you wanna find out what measures actually work and which ones don't make much of a difference. But what this shows is the accumulated deficit of the governments during this crisis period from 2008 up to 2012. And you see how the really deep crisis countries all accumulated much deficit during that period. And with Ireland on top, and they are on top because they saved the banks, and that was costly for the government and for the taxpayers. The banks were not saved in Iceland, so, but still we accumulated a significant deficit in Greece, Spain, and then the UK, Portugal, Lithuania. So big deficit accumulation goes with deep crisis in that sense. But then what was special about the Icelandic approach, and that is what I would call the strategy of redistribution. Iceland did not really set any major world record in using a Keynesian stimulus or in increasing welfare expenditures. They were certainly increased. But it was the redistribution, what happened and what was special and produced the favorable effect was, in fact, that the welfare expenditures were really expanded, but they were directed more. We had a relatively high level of welfare, but not by far, not at all the highest. But the expenditures were directed more towards the lower and the middle income groups, but cut what previously had gone to the higher income groups. So all the resources were directed sort of downwards in the income ladder. And the aim, the stated aim of the government was to shelter the more vulnerable groups in the society, and that was defined as the lower and the middle income groups. And the tax burden, I mentioned before that the overall taxes were increased. The bite of the income tax and the tax on businesses was increased, but the tax increase came primarily on the higher income groups, but for the lower income groups they got tax cuts, which is also a Keynesian stimulus, mind you. So, and then the benefits of the social protection system, they were primarily directed at the lowest income groups. Those who had nothing but the public social protection, they got their minimum pension guarantee. That was increased by 20% at the beginning of the crisis. And the aim of that was to keep everybody above the poverty line. Those who were most likely of falling further down under or falling under the poverty line, the idea was to keep them with a minimum pension. The minimum wages were increased a little, not much, but a little, unlike in Ireland where they cut the minimum wages and they cut the pensions. Then the unemployment benefit was also increased a little. We had a right to unemployment benefit for up to 2 years at the start of the crisis. That was extended to 4 years, during the crisis. So most of these expenditures or payments and benefits of the welfare system, they were channeled further to the lowest, very lowest income groups, and cut for like pensioners with average or higher earnings. They got some cuts. And then there was the debt relief measures. They became really quite important in Iceland during the crisis because debt, all household debts are connected to the consumer price index in Iceland. So that means that after the collapse, we got inflation, which went up to about 20%, and slightly less for another year. So it was an inflation explosion, which actually increased the principles of the debt of the households, which meant that the debt burden was increased. But also the households had lost some of their real earnings. So that became quite a big focus for the households, the burden of debt. So the demands on government to relieve the debt burden were quite big. And the government did a lot. They organized a program which the IMF says was the most generous such program since Roosevelt's program in 1935. And the main characteristics of that program were that you could get your debts cut, but that was only available for those in the really worst position, those who had very low equity in their homes, those who had lower incomes and more children in the family. They could get these measures, have their debt cut. But then on the other hand, the government also increased really in a big way the subsidy, the government subsidy of the interest cost of mortgages, of the housing loans. So, and these were directed also at the lower and middle income group. So the strategy of redistribution comes through all the policies, more or less. And then the last policy to measure was the activation. We never really had much activation measures in Iceland. There were some of them Scandinavian type labor market policies. But we've always, for a long time, had a very high employment participation and a very low level of unemployment. So there was not historically a really big need for activation, but these were really increased during the crisis as well, and they proved to be quite successful. Just to show you some figures here to show you how this was done in practice. This is the welfare expenditures. They're shown in real values at fixed prices, 2012 prices. And you see the social protection expenditures, that's what was significantly increased. That's the transfers to households, the benefits, and the pension minimum and unemployment benefit and so on. And on the other hand, there were cuts in welfare services and in healthcare services and in education, both of which Iceland had quite a high expenditure level before the crisis compared to the OECD countries. So that was a selected approach to really help use the welfare or the social protection system to help the finances of the households, which were in the worst position, but cut the services. And in both education and health, you could cut administrative costs, you could cut the VAT, which was significant in some areas, and then in the third year they started cutting staff, and now everybody is within the healthcare service. They're almost crazy now. They're not going to take any more cuts, and in fact the government last year when they were finalizing their budget, they did not intend to increase health expenditures, but they got a tremendous wave of protests from both within the healthcare services and in the society in general. So they changed the budget and increased the healthcare expenditures 2013. This shows you how the tax burden was changed. In fact, transferred from the higher, transferred from the lower income groups to the higher. And what we have here is what the columns show is the net effective tax burden for different income groups. On the left, you have the lowest 10% of the income groups, how much they paid out of their total earnings in direct taxes. In 2007, the lowest group was paying 3% of their total income in direct taxes. That was lowered to -3. And why they get more than they pay is because of the child benefit, which is primarily paid out through the tax system. And you see how the second lowest group their tax burden went from 10.5 to 7, and then up all the way up to group 6. That's where you got lower tax burden, which means for 60% of the households, the tax burden was lowered a little or significantly. But for the upper 40%, the tax burden was increased, particularly amongst the top 10 and the top 1%. So I don't know if that would qualify as a Piketty type tax on the rich, but probably to some extent. And that proved to be a good crisis measure. And here is the debt relief. The debt relief that the government pays. This what this line actually shows from 93 up to 2010, is the proportion of the interest cost of housing loans for the households that the government pays with its subsidy. That had been coming down from 27% to 12% in 2005. And after the crisis, the government increased that up to 31%, which means that the government was actually paying about a third of the interest cost of the households. And this was also done in a way such that, though this is for the average household, the lower income households got more subsidies. And the lowest 10%, they got 45% of their interest costs paid by government, which is a big subsidy. And this helped quite significantly through the crisis for the lowest income groups in particular. And then the debt, overall debt level of the households, you can see that here with some international comparison. To Iceland is the black fat line there, and it shows the total household debt as a percentage of the GDP. And, and you see how that was increasing through the bubble. That was part of what the private banks were doing. They were shoveling out money more than they should have, of course. And the overall debt level topped in 2009 and has come down by more than 20% since then. And you see the countries which have a higher debt. Denmark had a higher household debt level than Iceland through all of it. It's been like that for a long time. And the other countries up there with a higher debt level are 4 countries there. And in fact, the present government in Iceland is cutting the household debt even more. They've just implemented, they promised, in fact, they won the election last year on the promise that they were going to cut household debts by another 20%. And they claimed they were going to set a world record in cutting household debt. So they are implementing that now. It's not going to be as big as they promised, but the household debt is going to come down by some, probably in the region of 15% in the next 3 years, comes gradually. So we will be down to decent levels if anything is of this size is decent. Obviously too much debt, but that's part of the disease of modern societies, I think. So when we look at the distribution of incomes, there we see the consequences of the policies. Inequality of incomes had been increasing really quite fast during the bubble economy. The logic of that is, of course, is the fact that the bubble is primarily for the benefit of the top income groups. They are the ones who engage in the speculation, the top 1, top 5. In Iceland, there was probably about top 10 or 12% who actually took an active part in the speculation and gained while the going was good up to 2007. And at the same time, the government had actually lowered the tax burden on the highest income groups who were gaining the most. So these are Gini coefficients. The black columns show all taxable incomes. The inequality of all taxable incomes goes from about 0.2 up to 0.43, which is a major increase in inequality. It's probably unprecedented in a Western society in such a short time. And the gray columns exclude capital gains. And the capital gains is the sort of primary speculation income. So So we see how the turn to more equality is quite drastic after the collapse in 2008. And that was both a result of the decline in financial incomes, but also of the more redistribution of the tax and benefit policies of the government. So, and this is probably one of the more, and it underlies my argument that the strategy of redistribution or the strategy of equalization is really what makes Iceland's responses to the crisis special. And we see it here, that Iceland has by far the greatest equalization of income in Europe during the crisis from 2008 up to 2011. The Gini coefficient declined by almost 19%, more than about twice what happened in the next country, Lithuania. And when you look at the lower part of the graph, you will see that some of the deep crisis countries actually solved their crisis by increasing inequality. Look at Ireland, Hungary and Ireland. They both, that was a part of their crisis responses, both the welfare expenditures and the taxation policies increased the burden for the lower income groups, and you see the same in Spain, Cyprus, Greece, Estonia. But Iceland is not the only crisis country which equalized. Latvia and Lithuania did that too, and they actually succeeded in to some extent, but in a different environment though. And lastly, just to show you some comparison of the top 1% income share in Iceland and the US, which is also tells a little about the responses to the crisis. And what this shows is how big a share of the overall income of households the richest 1% got. These are the Piketty and Sayers figures. And we put in Iceland, we have comparable figures for the period from 1993. And this is all taxable incomes, including capital gains, pre-tax. And what this shows is that Iceland starts from a more egalitarian Nordic type of equal society with income distribution. But after the late 1990s, the speed in the increase of the top income share is really quite faster than what happened in the US after 1980 with the Reagan government and also in the UK with Thatcher government, who all sort of promoted more inequality or policies which produced more inequality. And at the top of the bubble in 2007, the top 1% in Iceland, they were almost getting 20% of the overall income, while in the US, which is the highest in the West, the US had 20 top 1% there had 23.5%. So, but it's also interesting to see what happened after the crisis. In the US, they had this little setback, but not so big at all. And they're up again, and probably this year they're back to the levels they were at before the crisis. But while Iceland stays down, not as small share as in the more equal time in the early 1990s, but at least that also reflects the different crises. And when you see the OECD is actually, while they in previous years or previous decades, they promoted inequality sometimes because they said it's good for growth. Now they're promoting the arguments that inequality is hindering growth, and that I think this graph would support that sort of position. So just to pull together the main points, the strategy of redistribution is what really characterizes the Icelandic approach. And it came about as a policy promise of the government, which took power immediately after the crisis. They promised to shelter the more vulnerable, households, and they characterized that as a Nordic welfare policy orientation. It involved a mixture of stimulus and austerity. And the fact that the redistribution was such a rich part of the policies, that meant that the need for austerity was less than otherwise would have been. And the negative effects of austerity on growth and unemployment was therefore less. So in a way, what one would want to argue is that the redistribution strategy goes particularly well with the Keynesian stimulus approach. It makes the utilization of the resources more efficient. So the need for austerity was less. And you achieve this sort of outcome by increasing the right types of expenditures, cutting the ones which you can be without. And that is always a difficult choice, of course. And you can also, the other lesson is that even though market economists always have a lot of arguments against the increasing taxation, that is supposed to have all the possible evils you can have in society. But our lesson is that if you increase the taxes on those who can actually carry an increased burden, that's okay. And that was the higher income groups and also the businesses, the firms. Those firms who are run at a loss, they don't pay any tax anyway, so that doesn't make their position worse. But those who are actually turning in profits, and some industries were actually doing well in Iceland, particularly export industries, they could carry an increased tax burden. And then you should do that. The more vulnerable, it was actually a success in sheltering them because we avoided a massive increase of poverty. It looked like it would do that the crisis would produce a really increased poverty burden. The relative poverty rate, the percentage of the population under the 60% poverty line, it had, traditionally in Iceland, it's been around 10%. It actually came down to about 8% during the crisis, which also reflects the fact that the lower income groups, they got less cuts than others. And particularly the elderly, the strategy of raising the minimum pension, this was particularly important. And one group, which is elderly ladies who are pensioners, and many of them never worked much in the labor market, so they didn't accumulate pension rights, occupational pension rights. They rely primarily on the public social security system. They were kept above the poverty line. And in fact, poverty amongst the elderly was significantly reduced during the crisis from about 15% down to 4 or 5%. So, and then, as I showed you, the debt relief measures, they had the same redistributive character, and the activation and job creation was quite a big success as well. So all of this was implemented primarily with government policies, and part of it was done in joint consultations with the labor market partners, the unions and the employers' federations. We have strong unions in Iceland, and as in other Nordic countries, and so they had some influence on these as well. And the overall outcome was that unemployment was kept at reasonably low levels and growth returned. So thank you.